Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles, and I'm the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you are interested to get in touch with us, you can give us a call at 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. If all this craziness in the world around you right now has you a little bit worried, then I hope it also has you thinking. Times of great stress often prompt people to turn toward God, and that's a good thing, of course. But the trouble is that often when the stress goes away, so does the emphasis on God. As things have seemed to spiral out of control and get crazier and crazier over the last few months, a lot of people have had to change their message a little bit and grow and learn and that sort of thing. But you know, the funny thing is, around here we haven't really had to change anything. Of course, it's affected our choice of topic, but it hasn't affected the message at all. It's still the same thing. Jesus is in charge, and you'd better get yourself on His side. Today we're going to be looking at one relatively minor point in that whole system, one relatively small instruction in the New Testament, but we'll be looking at it because it tells us something bigger. I want to start by showing you this picture here. Any idea what that is? You recognize it? A few of you out there do. What about if I show it to you in this context? Then perhaps it's a little bit easier for a few more people to pick up on exactly what this is. What I showed you was a depiction of the element xenon. Xenon is one of the elements that is called a noble gas. The reason for that is that it's very difficult to get it to react with any of the other elements. And that's because it has a full outer valence shell, and there's not any room for an extra electron to jump in there, and it also doesn't really have any spare electrons to give up. It's very comfortable in its natural state there, and it doesn't have any way to become more stable by joining to another atom. It was given the name xenon for a reason. It comes from the Greek word xenos. That is a word that means stranger, foreigner, outsider. And you might recognize that word or that root in terms like xenophobia, which would be an irrational animus toward those who are outsiders or strangers or foreigners. So how can it be then, now that we know a little bit about this concept, how can it be that Paul refers to a man named Gaius in Romans chapter 16, verse 23 as a xenos? That seems awfully strange. He obviously knows Gaius. Why would he call him a stranger or a foreigner or an outsider? Similarly, in Acts chapter 10, verse 23, Peter uses the same term. He invited them to be his xenoi, his foreigners, his strangers, his outsiders. That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Now, he doesn't know these people, but how could you invite somebody to be your outsider? And then later on in the book of Acts, chapter 28, verse 7, Publius received us and was our stranger for 3 days. That also doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? Can it be that he gave them a place to stay and yet didn't get to know them over that time? That seems pretty unlikely. That's far from an exhaustive list of the times that this term pops up, but I hope that it makes it clear that something is amiss here. Now, if you've read any of these passages in any decent translation, then you won't have found translations like stranger, foreigner, outsider, or anything like that. It's because all of these passages are talking about something different. They're talking about the unique relationship between a guest and a host. They're talking about hospitality. We're going to try to make sense of this seeming double meaning where a person can be both an outsider and also your host at the same time, and see what it meant to these New Testament writers, and then we'll see what it means for us today. Now, if you're kind of a nerd like me who studies words and their use and etymologies and language and that sort of thing, then you might have come across the word for hospitality in Greek before, and you might have heard of philoxenia being explained as a love of strangers. But while there's some truth to that, it's also a gross oversimplification that can keep us from fully understanding and appreciating as well as implementing the principle behind the practice. In the ancient Mediterranean world, there was a great need for and a great role played by hospitality. There are a number of reasons for this. One of them is that the weather conditions in that part of the world can be quite harsh at times. During the summer, it's very hot, it's very dry, water is often scarce, and on top of that, the water rights are pretty clearly defined and usually not up for grabs. It was also just part of a less affluent society where not as many people had the kind of wealth that was necessary in order to provide basic necessities for themselves while traveling. There was also less potential for hauling supplies with you while you were traveling because you can only carry what you can put on your back or on the back of your animal rather than loading it all up into the trunk of your car. They had no hotels. They did have inns, but those would not have looked like you might expect the Motel 6 to look today. Traveling just wasn't a year-round pursuit for most people, and tourism itself was not an industry. There were only a few extremely wealthy people who could afford to travel just for the sake of travel. It was also a less connected world than we've become used to, and a time when news traveled by foot, and a stranger coming to town was something of an event. Now, the words and concepts for hospitality and guests and hosts and that sort of thing show up very frequently in Greek literature, and when they do, there's not really any great one-size-fits-all translation for the terms. Sometimes you want to use the term guest or host, but that isn't usually enough, and sometimes you want to translate it friend, but then that doesn't really capture the relationship that has to do with the hospitality involved. There's a broader cultural practice at play where guests were taken in and the hosts gave them not only shelter and provision, but also gifts. And then the guests and the hosts will talk and exchange stories and exchange news. And then, in the best of circumstances, a long-lasting friendship will begin from that very moment. It pops up a couple of times in the Iliad and the Odyssey. In fact, the cause of the Trojan War, as the Iliad describes it, is a breach of hospitality in a manner of speaking. The Spartan king Menelaus has taken in an envoy from the city of Troy, which includes Paris, who is one of the princes of Troy, and instead of acting as a good guest should, he goes grossly beyond what he ought to do and actually steals his host's wife away. And thus begins this 10-year war. Well, in the middle of that war, there's an instance where two men meet on the battlefield. One's named Diomedes, another one is named Glaucon. And they meet on the battlefield, and they're about to kill each other. And then they recognize each other, and they say, wait a second. Didn't your great-granddaddy once act as host to my granddaddy? And then once they discover that and they go back over that story and they realize who each other are, they decide, well, we can't fight. And in fact, they stop in the middle of a battle and they strip their armor off and they exchange it and put on each other's armor with the understanding that they will recognize each other more easily that way and then avoid each other on the battlefield. It's not enough for them to say, well, I'm not going to fight against your team, but they are willing to say, I will not fight against you yourself, because our ancestors once shared the bonds of hospitality. Obviously, this matters a whole lot. In the Odyssey, one of the great conflicts is between Odysseus, the main character, and the suitors that are trying to gain his wife's favor back at home while he's away for these many, many years, having fought in the Trojan War and then having been slowed down substantially on his way home. Well, the suitors are guests in Odysseus' house, but they're not acting the way that guests should. Instead, they are making selfish use of Odysseus' possessions and taking everything that he has and basically eating him out of house and home in his absence. They're being very, very bad guests, and that is taken as justification for Odysseus to kill them all when he gets home. Obviously, there's a whole lot of baggage behind this concept, and it shows up in the Bible as well. In Genesis chapter 18, we see Abraham acting as a good host. Verses 1 through 8, And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, Do as you have said. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it, and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. Abraham doesn't seem to know who these 3 are at the start. He doesn't realize that they are from God and representing God, and yet look how he acts toward them. He displays an inordinate level of humility toward them. He runs to them and bows before them. You know, who's to say that these 3 are his social superiors? How in the world does he arrive at that conclusion? He sees them from afar and immediately responds this way. And then he begs them to stop and rest from the heat of the day at his home. He's deliberately protecting them from the discomfort of walking during the hottest part of the day, and he brings water for them, both for them to drink and also for washing their feet, which is a very humble gesture. And then he provides food for them, and it's not just whatever he happens to have that was ready. He makes something fresh. He tells his wife to make a bunch of bread, and the amount that he tells her to prepare, 3 seahs of fine flour, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 gallons of flour. That will make a lot of bread. And on top of that, veal. And it's as fresh as it can be. It's the whole calf that he prepares for these 3. And then he gives them cheese and milk. He basically whips up a feast at the drop of a hat because some strangers came around. And he had the audacity to call this a morsel in verse 5. And once it's prepared, he stands by while they sit and eat. He doesn't eat with them, and he doesn't grill them with questions while they're eating. He lets them enjoy their rest and their food. Abraham's not the only one who is hospitable. In the next chapter, his nephew Lot is also behaving hospitably. We won't go and read there, but when 2 of these same angels go to the city of Sodom, basically to warn Lot that he needs to get out of town before the whole place is destroyed, just like Abraham, Lot doesn't realize who they are or where they're coming from, and yet he takes excellent care of them, even protecting them from the horrible practices of the people of the town. So perhaps it's that hospitality kind of runs in the family, or perhaps it has more to do with it just being a cultural institution, a custom, a learned behavior, this hospitality. Now contrast that with the way that the people of the town behaved. They were very inhospitable toward these angels. And there's a similar case to this found in Judges chapter 19, where at least part of the atrocities committed there that leads to a ridiculous war between the tribes of Israel is an affront to hospitality when some strangers arrive in a town and are not treated as guests ought to be treated. So these are all instances where that kludgy definition, love of strangers, does decently capture the meaning of xenia and philoxenia fairly well. And yet, when we think about the lengths to which Abraham and Lot both went and the motives behind their actions, well, it's safe to say that it's beyond what we would normally expect. So now let's think about the fuller meaning of this term, xenos, guest/friend. It's not a great translation, but that's probably the best way to think about it. There's a long-standing relationship often built on a single instance of hospitality. Sometimes this can be seen in the frequency and the length of stay between the parties involved. We don't see that with Abraham and Lot in these cases because of the nature of their visitors. But what about Gaius back in Romans 16:23? Gaius was acting as host to Paul for as long as Paul needed, and he was also acting as host to the whole church, letting the church meet in his house on a regular basis. The same thing is apparent with Simon in Acts chapter 10. That man was actually hosting Peter at his house in Joppa for what is called their many days. For another Old Testament example, turn to 2 Kings chapter 4. Let's read verses 8 through 10. One day Elisha went on to Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived who urged him to eat some food. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat food. And she said to her husband, Behold, now I know that this is a holy man of God who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls, and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there. Consider the lengths to which this woman is willing to go in order to take good care of her frequent guest. Now, this develops a long-standing relationship between Elisha and this family. Pick up in verse 11. One day he came there, and he turned into the chamber and rested there. And he said to Gehazi his servant, Call this Shunammite. When he had called her, she stood before him, and he said to him, Say now to her, See, you have taken all this trouble for us. What is to be done for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? She answered, I dwell among my own people. And he said, What then is to be done for her? Gehazi answered, Well, she has no son, and her husband is old. He said, Call her. And when he had called her, she stood in the doorway, and he said, At this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son. And she said, No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant. But the woman conceived, and she bore a son about that time the following spring, as Elisha had said to her. Is this just an example of the prophet's foreknowledge of what was to come? It sounds an awful lot like a gift to me. Like he was a part of bringing this about. Well, in verses 18 through 37, the child grows up a little bit and then dies tragically one day. And when this occurs, Elisha is deeply distressed at this turn of events. And he prays and fumbles around and prays some more and fumbles around some more and eventually succeeds in raising the boy from the dead. And so we see two miracles occurring for this family. One is the birth of the child, and another is the resurrection of that child. Now, usually the point of miracles is to confirm the message that God is sending through his prophets. But Elisha doesn't really seem to have any message for this family. No, in fact, he's just trying to give them a gift. It's not payment for what they have done. It's not coming out of his pocket, but it's something greater. He cares very deeply about this family, and particularly the woman who seems to have developed a rather close friendship with him. And so he's willing to petition God on her behalf and bring it about that she has a son, and that son is not taken from her. So now we've seen hospitality in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and we've seen the welcoming and the serving of strangers, and not just in giving them food. It goes beyond that. Also, there's lodging, and often it's done repeatedly, and often for extended periods of time, and especially it's done for fellow servants of God. And in the best cases, it develops a long-standing relationship that is much closer than simple friends, to the mutual benefit of both the host and the guest. Thousands of years later, shouldn't we be even better at this? Shouldn't we be even more hospitable? And yet, generally, we're not. Why is that? Now, for the last several months, there's been a pretty good excuse that, well, we're all trying to do our best to slow down the spread of a virus, and having people over will be a terrible way to bring that about. And yes, that's fair enough. But there's also, in our culture as a whole, there's much less perceived need. We have things like hotels, and we have Airbnb now, and there are comfortable travel arrangements, and sometimes visitors are pretty few and far between. But this deficiency in our hospitality and our perceived need for hospitality leads, unfortunately, to a greater sense of isolation, and it detracts from the sense of brotherhood between us. We ought to be willing to treat each other as, for example, the Shunammite woman treated Elisha. And now that we have seen what hospitality really meant to the cultures involved, let's look at some New Testament exhortations to back this all up. In Matthew chapter 25, let's begin in verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. So Jesus is making it pretty clear that hospitality and all the things involved with that are going to be pretty instrumental in the final judgment. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, Paul says that an overseer in the church must be, among other things, hospitable. And the same thing is said later in the letter about widows who would be enrolled to be taken care of by the church's funds. In chapter 5, verses 9 and 10, let a widow be enrolled if she, among other things, has shown hospitality. And then in Philemon, verse 22, Paul makes a striking demand of this man, Philemon. He says, At the same time, prepare a guest room for me, for I am hoping that through your prayers I will be graciously given to you. He doesn't mean I intend to stay with you one night. He means I'm hoping to come to Colossae and stay with you over a rather long term. And he expects Philemon to be ready for that and to have a place for him to stay. In Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 and 2 say, Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. That's referring specifically back to Abraham and Lot, who both did exactly that. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 8 through 10 say, Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. And then finally, back in Romans chapter 12 this time, verse 13 says, Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. So you might be left asking yourself, how? How am I going to do this? Is it enough for me to invite my brother over for dinner once in a while? And that's a good start, but it doesn't really compare to the picture that we've been seeing in the Bible of what true hospitality is. What we have seen went much farther than that, and it was much more meaningful. It was much more sacrificial. We ought to be acting hospitably. That could include providing food and a place to sleep, but it ought to go a lot farther than that. It's about providing for people's needs, their most basic and their most enduring needs. Maybe that's food, lodging, maybe that's clothing, maybe that's employment, maybe it's a tank of gas. I've been the beneficiary of all of those things from my brothers when I was in need. Even more often than that, it's not the physical. People have need for advice and correction and teaching and accountability and reassurance and motivation and many other things along those lines. And I have also been the beneficiary of all of those things from my brothers when I was in need. Are you willing to be hospitable in the way that we have seen hospitality today? Now, your answer might be, well, yes, but right now it could kill them if I bring them over to my house. And that's certainly good to keep in mind, especially for those who are at higher risk. But for most of us, the risk is not really that high. You're far more likely to get the virus or to pass it on at Walmart. Your answer might instead be, yes, but I'm not equipped to provide those things. And I've certainly been there too. And in those cases, you do what you can. As I said, it's not always providing someone with a bed for the night. But if you can provide somebody with what they need here and now, whether that's something physical or something spiritual, then that's what we ought to be doing. You also might be tempted to respond, yes, I'm willing to do this, but no one ever needs these things. And if that's what you think, then you're not looking hard enough. That's what Paul has told us to do. He has told us to contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality, to actively pursue being hospitable. So that brings us to the question, why? Why should we do this? Now, it's one thing to say, well, God has told us to do it, and that ought to be enough. But beyond that, think about the way God has behaved toward us. God is hospitable, too. In the 23rd Psalm, David says in verses 5 and 6, "You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Even on earth, David imagined himself as the beneficiary of God's hospitality. He envisions it as if God prepares a table for him, as if he is dwelling in God's house. And there is a figurative sense in which that is true of everybody, and there's certainly a much more important figurative sense in which that is the case for Christians. But think about it in the most physical terms. Where did all of your possessions come from? Is your home really yours? Is the food you eat really yours? Is your bed really yours? All of them ultimately came from God. And that's not just a quaint Old Testament idea that David had. This is something that Jesus says as well. In John chapter 14, verse 2, Jesus tells his disciples, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you?" That's ultimately what Jesus wants to do. That was his entire goal, to prepare a room for you in his Father's house. But in order for him to prepare that place for you, you have to establish that relationship, that xenia, that lifelong friendship and commitment to a special code of conduct and a willingness to make sacrifices for each other's good. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and eat with him, and he with me." In order to be welcomed to his table, you must welcome him to yours. Now that's obviously figurative, of course, so what does it mean? Does it mean something like accept him into your heart? And that's really not a terrible description of it, but it's sorely lacking, and now it's been loaded through so many years of misuse. What it comes down to is that unholiness cannot coexist with Jesus in his presence. And so in order to have him come in and dine with you, you must be holy. You must be clean. In a manner of speaking, you must be washed for dinner. If you need to get out of the mud and be washed and prepared to dine with the King, then please reach out to us. We would love to help. We're not the gatekeepers, and all that we're really going to do is to show you what the Bible says and then assist you in doing those things if you so desire. Come, be a part of the family. Ezra, are you kidding me? What are you doing? Huh? Why are you even awake? It's 2 in the morning, you little turd. You're not poopy. Just go back to your bed and go to sleep, okay? I'll see you in the morning. Good night.